All right, let's dive into some brain science today. We're going to be looking at, well, your research actually, on what happens in our brains when we know a tough math problem is coming. You submitted some really interesting research from Klein and Beek and their team. It was published back in 2019. And they use brain imaging to see what lights up when people anticipate a challenging math task.
Yeah, one of the things that I found really interesting about that research was that it's not just people who identify as quote unquote math anxious
Hmm.
who experience this kind of pre-problem stress response.
Yeah, I was surprised by that too. The study found that even in folks who aren't particularly anxious about math, their brain still showed activity at the beginning.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah,
the area that we know as the negative emotions network. When they knew a difficult math problem was coming up, it's almost like our brains are hardwired to brace themselves for something bad, regardless of our actual math skills. So, I mean,
yeah.
what is going on there?
Well, you know that. That specific brain region is called the amygdala, and it's responsible for processing emotions like fear and anxiety. So, this suggests that this initial negative response could be a very basic human reaction to anything we perceive as difficult.
So it's not just math then.
Exactly. If you think about it, you probably get a similar feeling before a big presentation or even a difficult conversation. It's like our brains are giving us a heads up, a little warning signal that something challenging is about to happen. It's like, get ready.
Okay. So we get this warning signal, but then what? Do we completely freeze up?
Thankfully, no. The research also found activity in another part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is associated with cognitive control. That's our brain's control center, helping us regulate our emotions and make decisions.
So it's almost like our brain gives us a warning, but then also hands us the tools to deal with it.
Precisely. We're not just at the mercy of our emotions, we have the power to manage them, to prevent them from spiraling out of control, in fact. The researchers suggest that people who are good at regulating their emotions might be less likely to develop math anxiety in the first place.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating. But how do they do that? What are these emotion regulation techniques?
Well, there are a variety of techniques that can be helpful. Some people find that. Deep breathing exercises can calm their nerves. Others might use positive self-talk to reframe their thoughts and focus on their strengths. Still others might visualize themselves successfully completing the task.
So it's not about ignoring the feeling, but about having a strategy to deal with it.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, I want to get back to the math itself for a second. The study used different types of math problems, right? Some with fractions, some with decimals, even some using visual representations like pie charts. Did the type of problem make a difference in the brain activity? That's what's so interesting. Researchers found the same pattern of brain activity, that initial amygdala activation, followed by the prefrontal cortex kicking in. Regardless of the specific type of math problem, this suggests that the brain's response isn't tied to a particular type of math, but rather to the overall perceived difficulty of the task. It's that. This is going to be hard feeling. That seems to trigger the response.
That is interesting. But now I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. The study focused on folks who weren't particularly math anxious. So
Yeah.
can we really say for sure that people who really struggle with math anxiety would show the same brain activity? I mean, wouldn't it be more intense for them?
You raise a valid point. It's definitely possible that the intensity of the brain activity could be different for people with high math anxiety. More research is needed to explore that, however. Even with that limitation in mind, I still think this research gives us valuable insight into a more universal experience. It tells us that those initial feelings of dread before a difficult math task might be way more common than we realize. And it really highlights how important it is to be able to manage those emotions. How we handle those initial feelings can make a real difference in how we approach the challenge.
Yeah, that makes sense. Our ability to regulate those emotions is key.
Hmm.
Now, I remember reading that the research also looked at how people perceive the different types of math problems. They had participants rate their feelings about them. Can you tell us more about what they found?
Absolutely. So what they found is really interesting. The participants actually rated the more difficult tasks, things like fractions and those dot patterns, as more negative. They used the term threatening to describe those. And the easier tasks like decimals and pie charts were seen as more positive or challenging.
So it's not just about how hard the math actually is. It's also about how our brains interpret that difficulty, right?
Exactly. And that interpretation can have a huge impact on how we approach the problem. If we see it as a threat, we're more likely to want to avoid it altogether. But if we see it as a challenge, we might actually feel more motivated to tackle it.
So how can we shift our thinking from threat to challenge?
Well, that's where those cognitive control skills come in. We can actually train ourselves to reframe our perception of difficulty. For example, instead of thinking, I'm terrible at fractions, I'm going to fail this, we can try thinking, okay, fractions are tough, but I'm going to give it my best shot. Maybe I'll even learn something new.
So it's about changing that internal dialogue,
Yeah,
that inner critic that can sometimes hold us back.
precisely. And it's not about pretending something isn't difficult. It's about acknowledging the difficulty, but choosing to see it as an opportunity for growth rather than a reason to give up.
I love that. It's about having a growth mindset, right? Embracing the challenge.
Exactly. And the more we practice these cognitive control skills, the better we get at managing those initial negative responses. And approaching challenges with a more positive outlook, it becomes almost like a habit.
This is all starting to make a lot of sense. But you know what? I want to bring this back to our listener for a moment. What does all this brain science really mean for their everyday life?
Well, I think the key takeaway here is that next time you feel that familiar wave of dread, before a tough task, whether it's a math problem, a presentation at work, or even a difficult conversation you need to have, just remember that it's just your brain's way of signaling a potential challenge.
It's that get ready signal we were talking about earlier.
Right. And it's important to remember that you're not powerless in the face of that feeling. You have the ability to choose how you respond. You have those tools we've been talking about, those cognitive control skills, the ability to reframe your perception of the situation.
You have the power to shift from that threat mindset to a challenge mindset. And that could make all the difference.
Absolutely. You're not at the mercy of your initial emotional response. You get to choose how you react. And that choice can have a big impact, not only on how you perform, but also on how you feel about yourself in the process.
Okay, so to recap what we've learned, even just thinking about a tough math problem can trigger a negative emotional response in the brain. But that doesn't mean we're doomed to freeze up or fail, right? Our brains are also equipped with these amazing tools to regulate those emotions and prevent them from taking over.
And what's really encouraging is that we can actually strengthen those emotion regulation skills over time. It's like working out a muscle. The more we practice, the stronger we become.
So it's not about becoming some kind of emotionless robot. It's about becoming more, flexible and resilient when it comes to facing challenges.
Exactly. It's about recognizing those initial feelings of anxiety or dread, but not letting them define your actions or your abilities. You have the power to choose a different path.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what's one key takeaway you want to leave our listener with today?
Well, we've been focusing on math here, but I think this applies to so many areas of life. Think about all the other situations where you might experience a similar threat response. It could be public speaking or creative projects. Maybe it's even certain social interactions. The key is to recognize that this response is a natural part of being human. It's just our brain doing its job, trying to protect us. But instead of letting it paralyze you, use it as a cue to engage those cognitive control skills. Reframe the situation. Approach it with confidence and a growth mindset. Remember, you've got this to form.
Such a great point. You have the power to choose how you respond. And thanks to the amazing capabilities of our brains, we have the tools we need to face those challenges head on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time for another fascinating exploration of knowledge,